So welcome to the course. This is Readings in Early African Christianity, Part 2. And the focus of this course is on the city of Carthage and its vicinity. So Carthage and the areas around Carthage in early Christianity. The first thing I want to do in our first lesson is to talk about the course overall, to give you the overall picture of what's going to happen in the course, to talk about the general topics in the course, but then to go through the readings a little bit to give you a sense of who the different authors are and where they fit into the picture of early Christianity. So a copy of the syllabus you should have available to you. This is primarily looking at what in the ancient world was called Africa. So when the Romans spoke of Africa, they talked about not the whole continent of Africa, they talked about a very particular part of Africa. And we'll talk more about this as the lessons go along. We'll be talking about the city of Carthage and many of the famous authors who were in Carthage or who visited Carthage. So authors like Tertullian and Cyprian, Augustine will also be important in our conversation. Talking about them, we'll be talking about some of the issues that happen in this part of the world. So one of the great divisions in the African church happened in the 4th century with something called the Donatist controversy. We'll be talking about what the Donatist controversy is, where it came from, what caused it, and how did it impact the church in Africa. The Pelagian controversy is important in Africa because of Augustine. So we'll be talking about Pelagius and what is Pelagianism and how did that fit within the overall development of Christian theology. We'll also be talking about what we call the end of African Christianity, or is there an end to African Christianity? What happens in the later periods with the arrival of the Vandals sweeping down from Europe? What happens with the arrival of Islam? At the end of the course, we'll be touching on these things. So it's a broad historic sweep. And what we're going to be doing in these courses together while I'm here is walking through some of the primary issues. And then later in the course, you'll be going back through and reading a lot of these primary texts and looking at them and asking questions about them more in depth. So on the syllabus, you have a list of recommended books, and my expectation is not that you're going to buy all of these, but these are possible resources that you might find helpful. And this includes Peter Brown's book on Augustine, which is considered by many people the single best book on Augustine that's ever been written. It's now available in the revised edition, and this is probably, if you have one book on Augustine, this is probably the book you would want to have. A book on Cyprian the Bishop by Patou Burns, another very good resource. And actually, Patou Burns and his wife Robin Jensen wrote a book on Christianity in Roman Africa, a very thick volume that goes into the extensive history, archaeology, that's also on the list. My book on the veneration of Paul is also on the list as a possible reference. James Papandreou's book on reading the early church fathers, because he goes through in a very systematic way and talks about different church fathers and how they fit in. He's very interested in the West, so there's a lot of coverage of Africa. Brent Shaw's book on sacred violence. This is a very thick book in terms of it's physically thick, but it's also very dense in terms of its content. It's not the kind of book you pick up and just read through. It's more a book that you might look at a little bit at a time. But he really takes up the question of violence and the role of violence. And as we've learned by studying church history, unfortunately, violence is part of church history. Christians against Christians, as well as other varieties of violence. Maureen Tilley's book, The Donatist Martyr Stories, we will be using that book in this course. It provides short introductions and translations of these different martyrdom accounts, which are very important, and she helps give us some very good historical context for these texts. And then David Wilhite's book, Tertullian the African. So looking at Tertullian, particularly as a theologian from Africa, how does his African identity and his African sense of practice and of theology influence what he writes? So these are some of the recommended books that you might want to choose from some of these. The other course requirements are covered on the syllabus, the research paper that you'll be writing in consultation with the instructor, the journaling and the response papers that you'll be doing throughout the course of the semester. That's all talked about in the syllabus, and more questions about that can be answered as we move along. So this week, as I mentioned earlier, I want to hit on some highlights. So tonight we're going to talk about Rome and North Africa. What is the connection of Rome with North Africa? It's a very important connection to understand a lot of the history. We can't talk about what happened in North Africa without knowing something about Rome. And I would say in early Christianity, you can't talk about what happens in Rome without knowing something about North Africa. So that'll be part of the first unit that we do. Then we'll talk more about African identity, about martyrdom and persecution, which is a very important part of the story of early Christianity in Africa. We have several lectures on Tertullian, several lectures on Cyprian, the bishop, several lectures on the Donatist controversy, some lectures on Augustine, and then a series of lectures about the end of Christian antiquity in Africa. And those are the things that we're going to cover in the lectures. And then as you go through the readings, you'll be covering some of these things again. Some of the topics will be directly related to our lectures, and some of them will be other kinds of questions that you'll be asking. So the syllabus moves basically chronologically. So we start with the earliest of the writers, who was a Christian apologist named Minucius Felix. And you'll be reading part of his work called the Octavius. And we'll talk about him more during the course to give you some background for who he is. He's one of the early important writers. He's from Africa, and he's trying to explain Christianity to the outside world. Tertullian is the next major author you'll be doing in the readings, and you'll be reading a selection of his writings, both Tertullian as an apologist for Christianity, but also Tertullian as a theologian. And in our time together, we're going to talk about both of these parts of his identity. Tertullian writing as an apologist, as someone who's explaining Christianity, and Tertullian writing as a theologian, someone who's constructing Christian theology. And how is it different to be an apologist versus being a theologian? Cyprian is the next topic. We'll be reading elements of some of his very important letters. Some of you may know, we'll be talking about this week. Cyprian dealt with some very difficult questions in his time, some very challenging questions in his time that we don't have in exactly the same form today, but the spirit of the questions that Cyprian is dealing with, I would say, are very much alive and well in the church today, having to do with how do you determine who should be in the church, who should not be in the church, and what is the church at its essence. These are important questions that Cyprian deals with that'll be in the readings. Be reading from a church historian named Lactantius. Lactantius is writing in the period after Constantine, and he's looking back and he's telling the story of Christianity and the story of how, in his mind, what happened throughout history was God's judgment on those who had been persecuting Christians. And so he has a very particular view of history. He's not trying to tell an objective history. He's trying to tell a story of the triumph of Christianity and the defeat of those who would hurt Christians. So you'll be reading Lactantius. Then come some readings on the Donatists and Donatist martyr stories and how the martyr stories are used to try to settle an ecclesiastical debate, a debate between two different authority structures, between two different bishops. The next two authors are closely related. One is named Optatus, and Optatus is someone that not many people know about, but in his time he was very important. He wrote against the Donatists. So he represents a very particular perspective on the Donatist controversy. Be reading him, and then Augustine. Augustine was also very strongly against the Donatists. He was aware of this in his own time. So you have Augustine writing against the Donatists. You have Augustine writing as a pastor and a bishop. Augustine writing as a theologian. Augustine writing as a person with his confessions. And we'll be engaging with Augustine in these different forms of his life and his existence. Following Augustine, we have this Quod Vult Deus, What God Wills, an author from Carthage, who writes a series of homilies on the Creed, trying to explain the Creed of Nicaea, and what does it mean? He's giving commentary on the Creed to try to explain to his readers what it means. And the last 2 weeks of the course are readings focused on the latter centuries of antiquity in Africa. Victor of Vita, who writes a history of the persecution once the Vandals arrive. So the Vandals, many of them are Christians, but they are Arian Christians. and they arrive to Africa as military invaders, but the Christians in Africa are not Aryans. And so there's a conflict there between Aryan Christians and non-Aryan Christians. And Victor's account tells a story about these Aryan Christians not being very kind to the Africans. And then the final week looks at the end of early Christian Africa with a question mark. Is there an end to early Christian Africa? What happens in the 6th century, the attempt by the Romans to recapture Africa and make it their own again, and then with the arrival of Islam, what does that mean for Africa as we think about this? So those are the readings that you'll be going through during the course of the semester. And so I hope that this week gives us an overview, some general context, so that going back through the readings in more detail, we have a better idea of who these authors are and where they fit into the overall story, and maybe a little bit more context to help us understand why they might say some of the things they say, why might they have certain perspectives, and what are their motivations for writing. So are there any questions about the general overview of the course or the syllabus, what we'll be doing in the course? Oh yes, well on the syllabus, all the names are on the syllabus? Yes, yeah, and there are many names that I pronounce one way and you may hear them a different way, so yes. So all the names are on the syllabus, yes, with all the readings.